There are some loves in history that change not only the hearts of two people, but also the fate of empires. The story I will tell you today is the story of just such a love, the immortal love of Prince Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. The English throne had been surrounded by rules, traditions, and discipline for centuries. A king was not only a ruler, he was also a symbol. Therefore, even the love of a monarch could touch the fate of the entire empire. When Edward was born in 1894, it seemed his destiny was already written. He was the heir to the English throne, the future king. His childhood was spent within the magnificent walls of the palace, but Edward was different from other princes. He never adapted to the strict protocols, the cold rules, or the dull atmosphere of the palace. Within him was a soul that refused to be chained. Over the years, he became the people's darling. With his good looks, charm, and warm demeanor, he won the hearts of the British people. But deep down, he longed for someone who would understand him, touch his heart, and set his soul free. Edward VIII. Before he became known as Edward, he was known publicly as Prince Charming. Charismatic, free-spirited, and able to establish genuine relationships with the people, this prince quickly won the affection of the English people. But the woman who would steal his heart would come from a completely different world. That woman was Wallis Simpson, a strong, elegant, and impressive woman from America, from an ordinary family. But in the eyes of England's cold and rigid aristocracy, Wallis was not a suitable wife at all. Not only was she a foreigner, she was also twice married and divorced. Yet the traditions of the Church and State of England never permitted a king to marry a divorced person. That was when Wallis Simpson entered his life. She was American, not an aristocrat, and moreover, twice married and divorced. In the eyes of the English nobility, this was completely unacceptable. But for Edward, Wallis was a completely different world. A strong, confident woman, captivating with her intelligence and grace. Next to her, Edward was not just a prince, he was a real person. Wallis came from an ordinary American family. She was notable for her strong character, sharp wit, and sophisticated manner. But she had a major flaw. She was twice married and divorced. In 1930s England, divorce was still considered a major taboo. A king's wife, in particular, had a history of divorce, which was completely unacceptable to the church. But these obstacles were irrelevant to Edward. In his eyes, Wallis was unique not for her beauty, but for her soul. She was the only person who understood Edward's loneliness and touched his heart. This love affair began to shake the foundations of the empire. The court, the government, and the Church of England opposed the relationship, as it was considered religiously and politically impossible for a king to marry a divorced woman. Edward and Wallis' relationship quickly spread by word of mouth. Newspapers remained silent for a long time to avoid direct conflict with the royal family. But as the whispers spread, a major public debate began. The working class and some of the populace said, "As long as our king is happy, that's enough." But this was unacceptable to the church, the government, and the aristocracy. The king was obligated to represent the honor of the empire, not his personal happiness. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin's words summed up the atmosphere of the time. His Majesty may marry any woman he chooses, but not as king. The government began to pressure Edward. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, claiming that this relationship jeopardized the empire, demanded that he either give up Wallis or abdicate the throne. For the first time in English history, a king had clashed with his people, his government, and his church over his love. With each encounter, their bond grew stronger. This intimacy, which began in the salons of London society, soon blossomed into a deep and unwavering love. Edward could breathe in Wallis's presence and hear her heartbeat. But love is a force beyond rules. As Edward and Wallis got to know each other, their bond grew even stronger. Wallis's intelligence, self-confidence, and grace captivated Edward. She was not just a lover for him, she was also a haven. She was the only person with whom he could escape the heavy responsibilities of the English throne and become a true human. 1936, Edward ascended to the throne following his father's death. Now he was King Edward VIII of England. But in his heart, there was only one name: Wallis. The world held its breath. Everyone awaited Edward's decision. Either he would retain his throne and remain at the helm of the empire, or he would choose his love, but he would pay a price that would go down in history. And Edward made perhaps the most romantic, most courageous decision in history. This love affair was causing a storm in the palace corridors. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, the Church of England, members of the government, all believed this relationship had to be ended because Wallis could not be the king's consort. And when the calendars turned to 1936, a historic turning point had been reached. After his father's death, Edward ascended to the throne. Now he was King Edward VIII of England. But in his heart, there was only one name: Wallis. Either retain the throne and become the symbol of the empire, or choose love and renounce the kingdom. Edward uttered the sentence that became history: "I abdicate, for I cannot serve as king without the support of the woman I love." And so, on December 11th, 1936, in a speech heard by millions on the radio, Edward VIII abdicated. It was the first time in British history that a king had renounced the empire for love. He was succeeded by his brother, George VI, father of today's Queen Elizabeth II, and Edward would now be known simply as a prince. But he continued to live with Wallis as a free man. Edward and Wallis married in 1937. They spent the rest of their lives away from England, traveling in Paris and America. They had no palaces, no thrones, but they had love. And that love was sealed with one of history's greatest sacrifices. They spent the rest of their lives in exile in Europe and America, a life free yet solitary, far from the walls of palaces, on the streets of Paris, in the sunshine of the Riviera, in the crowds of New York, but always side by side. Edward never stopped calling Wallis "my love" until the end of his life. Wallis knew she had lost everything, but she had also found everything: Edward's heart. Years passed, time slowly wore them both out, but in Edward's eyes, Wallis was always the same captivating woman. When Edward passed away in 1972, Wallis remained by his side. She lived in the shadow of her love until her death. To this day, this story is remembered as one of history's most unforgettable love sagas, for a king had left behind an empire for his love. History books often portray the 1930s as a time of economic depression, rising fascism, and the shadows of impending war. But those years are remembered not only for their political turmoil, they are remembered for a heartbreaking love story. The pain of World War I was still fresh. The people of Britain were struggling to heal their wounds after the devastation. Although factories were back in business, unemployment was high, and the chasm between social classes was deep. On one side stood opulent palaces, on the other, the working class, living in abject poverty. People sought security, stability, and morality from the monarch at the helm. For a king was not only a head of state, but also a spiritual symbol of the people.
This is precisely why Edward's love was no ordinary affair. This love straddled the fine line between morality and scandal in the eyes of society. And perhaps this story whispers to us, sometimes a person comes into our lives for whom we would leave the entire world behind.